7B-2 stealth bombers, 14 of the most powerful conventional bombs ever built in human history, 3 underground nuclear sites that Iran spent decades and billions of dollars hiding beneath mountains of solid rock and reinforced concrete. In roughly 25 minutes of actual weapons employment, it was over. I'm Ryan, former F-15E combat pilot with combat deployments, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and now a commercial airline captain flying the Boeing 737 and Airbus A220. And I need to walk you through exactly what happened on the night of June 21st, 2025. Because what the United States military executed that night was unlike anything we have seen in the history of modern air power. This wasn't a routine airstrike. This wasn't a cruise missile salvo. This was the culmination of 15 years of planning, engineering, and strategic patience, all delivered in a single night by crews who took off without even telling their families where they were going. Here's exactly what we are going to cover today. First, I'm going to take you back to why Iran built these sites underground in the first place, because you cannot understand this strike without understanding the doctrine behind the target. Then, I'm going to break down the weapon at the center of this whole operation, the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, what it is, how it works, and why it had never been used in actual combat until that night. After that, we walk through Operation Midnight Hammer step by step, from the runway at Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri, all the way to impact on Iranian soil. Then I give you my honest pilot's read, not the press conference version, the real analysis on what this operation actually achieved and where the genuine open questions remain. And we close with the strategic bottom line, what this means for Iran, for the region, and for every nation on Earth that watched this unfold. Let's go. To understand why this mission was such a big deal, you have to go back to the 1980s, because that's where Iran's underground doctrine was born. During the Iran-Iraq War, Iranian cities, military installations, factories, and infrastructure were bombed relentlessly. Iran had virtually no modern air defense network. It had no meaningful long-range strike capability to retaliate. What Iran had was territory, population, and a willingness to absorb punishment. But absorbing punishment taught Tehran a lesson that has shaped its military thinking ever since. Anything you build above ground can be destroyed from the air. If you want your most critical military and strategic assets to survive a conflict against a technologically superior adversary, and Iran knows the United States and Israel are exactly that, you cannot leave them on the surface. You put them underground. You put them under mountains. You bury them so deep that conventional weapons cannot reach them, and you make the cost of any potential strike so high in planning complexity and escalation risk that an adversary might think twice before ever pulling the trigger. That doctrine drove every major Iranian strategic construction decision for the next 4 decades. By the early 2000s, Iran had developed what it called its missile cities, hardened underground tunnel complexes housing ballistic missile production, storage, and launch infrastructure, buried beneath remote mountains across the country. These weren't small facilities. These were industrial-scale underground installations with their own power, ventilation, rail systems, and storage capacity. The IRGC, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, was extraordinarily proud of them, and for good reason. They had engineered survivability into the architecture of their deterrent. And then there was the nuclear program. The Fordow enrichment facility is the single most hardened nuclear installation ever built by any nation outside of a declared nuclear weapon state. It sits beneath approximately 88 to 90 meters of solid mountain rock. Not earth, not soil, actual mountain. It was specifically designed with one objective: survive an Israeli or American airstrike. Iran began digging Fordow in secret around 2006, buried it inside a mountain near the holy city of Qom, and the United States didn't publicly reveal its existence until 2009. When President Obama disclosed the facility alongside British and French leaders, Iran had already been constructing it for years. The message was unmistakable. We have been building in secret, we built it to be indestructible, and there is nothing you can do about it. Natanz was Iran's primary enrichment facility, the industrial heart of the nuclear program. While portions of Natanz were above ground, its critical centrifuge halls were buried beneath reinforced concrete bunkers designed to withstand significant conventional attack. Thousands of centrifuges spun continuously in those halls, enriching uranium toward higher and higher levels of purity. Isfahan was the third major site, and in many ways the most strategically significant. Isfahan housed the largest share of Iran's enriched uranium stockpile, material that had already been processed and was being stored. Some assessments put the percentage of Iran's total enriched uranium inventory held at Isfahan at nearly 60%. Isfahan's underground structures were buried even deeper than Fordow. Iran had deliberately concentrated its most valuable nuclear material in the place it considered the safest. Taken together, Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan represented Iran's nuclear insurance policy. They were the physical manifestation of Tehran's belief that it had engineered itself beyond the reach of American or Israeli air power. For years, honestly, for decades, that belief had some basis in reality. Israel's aircraft couldn't carry weapons heavy enough or precise enough to reach Fordow. Even American planners acknowledged that conventional strike options against the deepest portions of these facilities were extremely limited. Iran had, by all appearances, successfully buried its nuclear program beneath physics that no one could overcome. That calculation changed with one weapon, the GBU-57 Massive Ordnance Penetrator, the MOP. Let me walk you through this thing carefully because it is genuinely extraordinary. The MOP weighs 30,000 pounds, that is 15 tons, in a single bomb. It is approximately 20 feet long. It is precision guided using GPS and inertial navigation to put it exactly where planners want it to go. And it was designed from the very first drawing board concept for one specific mission set, destroying deeply buried and hardened underground targets, not surface targets, not lightly fortified bunkers, targets buried under hundreds of feet of rock and reinforced concrete, targets exactly like Fordow. The physics of how it works are worth understanding. The MOP doesn't simply explode on contact with the ground, it penetrates. The weapon is engineered to punch through layer after layer of earth, rock, and concrete before its fuse triggers detonation. Those fuses are specifically programmable. Each MOP can be calibrated for a different delay, a different penetration depth, a different detonation profile, depending on exactly what the target geometry looks like underground. When the weapon finally detonates, deep inside or immediately beneath a subterranean structure, it generates what's called an overpressure effect. A shockwave radiates outward through the surrounding rock and into any enclosed underground space. You don't need to place the bomb directly on a centrifuge. You need the shockwave from a weapon that has already penetrated hundreds of feet into the earth to do the destructive work for you. The development program for the MOP cost over $3 billion and took the better part of 15 years. And here is the detail I keep coming back to. There is only one aircraft in the United States military inventory that can carry this weapon. One, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. Its internal weapons bay is the only one large enough to accommodate the MOP's size and weight. No fighter jet, no conventional bomber, no other platform can deliver this weapon. If you want to employ the MOP against a target, you need a B-2, and you need to fly it to wherever that target is, undetected, without getting shot down. For years, the MOP was tested, refined, evaluated, and held in reserve. It had never been dropped on an actual target in an actual combat operation. Every test had been conducted against simulated or constructed targets in a controlled environment. The real question, does this weapon actually work against the specific geology and construction of Fordow, could only be answered one way. June 21st, 2025 was the answer. Now let me walk you through the operation itself, because the execution of this mission is as remarkable as the weapon it employed. At 12:01 a.m. on Saturday, June 21st, 2025, B-2 Spirit stealth bombers began rolling down the runway at Whiteman Air Force Base in Knob Noster, Missouri. The crews, 2 pilots per aircraft, had been briefed on their mission. Their families had not been told. Some of those families found out where their pilots were going at roughly the same moment the world did, on the evening of June 21st, when the news broke that the United States had struck Iran. Think about what I just said. These crews flew a mission of that magnitude knowing their families had no idea where they were or what they were doing. That is the weight those pilots carried for 18 hours in a cockpit. I want you to hold on to that. The total strike package assembled for Operation Midnight Hammer exceeded 125 aircraft. This included 4th and 5th generation fighters providing escort and defensive counter-air support, aerial refueling tankers, because nothing gets to Iran and back without multiple refueling cycles, electronic warfare platforms, intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance assets, and the 7 B-2 Spirits carrying the MOPs. On top of that, a U.S. guided missile submarine operating somewhere in the central command area of responsibility was positioned and ready to launch Tomahawk cruise missiles at Isfahan. Now here's a detail I find genuinely impressive from a planning standpoint. The mission planners built a deliberate deception operation directly into the flight profile. 6 B-2s flew west, toward the Pacific, after takeoff. The intent was to create the impression, for any adversary intelligence collection that might be watching aircraft departure signatures out of Whiteman, that the bombers were heading in that direction. Only an extremely small number of planners and senior leaders knew the actual strike force was the 7th B-2, and the 6 others would eventually turn and join it from a completely different approach direction. The real strike package flew silently eastward, minimal radio communications, no signals that would give away position or intent. 18 hours in the air to reach the target area. 6 B-2s attacked Fordow first. The targeting approach was precise and methodical. Each of the 2 main ventilation shafts at Fordow was targeted with a sequence of MOP bombs. The first bomb in the sequence was fused to detonate on initial impact, destroying the concrete cap covering the ventilation shaft and physically opening it up. The following bombs were then fused to penetrate deep into the now exposed shaft and detonate at depth, generating the overpressure shockwave inside the underground facility. 12 GBU-57s hit Fordow, 6 B-2s, 2 ventilation shafts, and a weapon sequence calibrated to maximum effect deep underground. A 7th B-2 simultaneously struck the centrifuge facility at Natanz with 2 more MOPs. Total MOP employment across the entire operation. 14 weapons dropped in combat for the first time in history against the 2 most hardened nuclear targets on the planet. Simultaneously, the submarine in the Central Command area launched more than 24 Tomahawk land attack cruise missiles at key surface infrastructure targets at Isfahan, power systems, access infrastructure, above-ground support facilities. The Tomahawks worked the surface while the B-2s worked underground at Fordow and Natanz. After releasing their weapons, all aircraft exited Iranian airspace and began the long transit home to Whiteman Air Force Base. The satellite imagery that emerged in the hours and days following the strike was striking, no pun intended. Crater impacts were visible on the ridgeline above Fordow where the MOPs had entered. The physical topography of the mountain had been visibly altered. Multiple tunnel entrances were blocked with displaced earth and debris. The structure of what Iran had spent years engineering as an impenetrable sanctuary had been reached, penetrated, and destroyed from the inside. General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, stood at the Pentagon podium and called it the largest B-2 operational strike in American history. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth said Iran's nuclear ambitions had been, and I'm paraphrasing his language here, obliterated. President Trump announced the completion of strikes on Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan publicly. Now, here is my honest pilot's assessment. And this is where I'm going to push past the press conference and give you what I actually think. From a pure air power planning and execution standpoint, what happened on June 21st was exceptional. The mission planning depth alone is staggering. 15 years of preparation. A weapon system developed specifically for this target set and held in reserve until it was needed. A deception operation built into the flight profile. Joint coordination between strategic bombers, tactical fighters, tankers, intelligence platforms, and a submarine, all synchronized against 3 separate targets in a single night. The crews flew 18 hours to put weapons precisely on target and 18 hours back. That is the kind of execution that does not happen by accident. That is the product of relentless training, disciplined planning, and an institutional commitment to getting it right when it actually matters. The first operational use of the MOP on the hardest targets it could possibly face, and it performed. That is an enormously significant data point, not just for this conflict, not just for Iran, for every nation on Earth that is invested in underground hardened facilities as a deterrent against American or Allied air power. The physics of rock and concrete are no longer the protection they used to be. But I want to be fair and balanced here because there are genuine open questions that deserve honest treatment. Isfahan is the one that keeps me up at night analytically. Isfahan holds the largest share of Iran's enriched uranium, material that has already been processed and represents the most immediately usable component of any nuclear weapons pathway. And Isfahan was not struck with MOPs. Isfahan was struck with Tomahawk cruise missiles against surface infrastructure. The reason, according to reporting and confirmed briefings, is that Isfahan's underground structures are buried even deeper than Fordow, deeper than the MOP was assessed to reliably reach. So planners made the decision to target surface infrastructure rather than attempt a deep penetration strike that might not have achieved the desired effect. I want to flag this carefully because I think it matters enormously. Satellite imagery in the days after the strike showed vehicles present at Isfahan and tunnel entrances that had been cleared of obstructions within roughly 48 to 72 hours of the attack. That does not mean the strike failed. Surface infrastructure damage can be severe and consequential, but it does raise a legitimate question about the deepest underground portions of Isfahan and the enriched uranium stockpile housed there. Senator Lindsey Graham said it publicly in a congressional briefing. The program was obliterated at those 3 sites. But Iran still had roughly 900 pounds of highly enriched uranium, and nobody was publicly confirming exactly where that material was or what its status was after the strikes. When you're talking about material potentially sufficient for multiple nuclear devices, the accounting of that stockpile is not a secondary concern. It is arguably the most important question of the entire operation. There's also the intelligence layer I want to acknowledge. At least one early post-strike assessment from the Defense Intelligence Agency raised questions about whether the strikes fully destroyed the underground infrastructure at every site. The Pentagon pushed back on that characterization. I'm not in a position to adjudicate classified intelligence assessments, and neither is anyone outside those briefing rooms. What I can tell you is that the existence of conflicting assessments means the full picture is genuinely uncertain, And anyone telling you with absolute confidence exactly what was or was not destroyed is probably overstating what they actually know. And then there is the broader strategic question I always return to when I think about single event strikes against a state-level adversary. You can destroy facilities. You cannot destroy knowledge. Iran's nuclear scientists did not die in these strikes. The institutional knowledge of how to enrich uranium, how to design centrifuge cascades, how to build and harden underground infrastructure. None of that disappears when a building does. Iran announced, even before the dust settled, that it was planning construction of a third enrichment facility. Tehran's response to having its nuclear sites struck was not capitulation. It was acceleration. Here is the bottom line. Operation Midnight Hammer was a genuine milestone in the history of American air power. First operational use of the MOP, the largest B-2 strike in history. A 15-year plan executed with precision against targets Iran had specifically engineered to be unreachable. Fordow and Natanz, facilities Iran spent decades and enormous resources building as an indestructible underground nuclear sanctuary, were reached, penetrated, and struck by weapons that generated killing overpressure hundreds of feet beneath the surface of a mountain. The crews who flew that mission performed at an extraordinary level under an extraordinary burden that deserves to be stated clearly. The strategic achievement is real. Iran's nuclear enrichment infrastructure at Fordow and Natanz has been severely degraded. The timeline to any potential nuclear weapon, whatever that timeline actually was, has been pushed back. The physical evidence from satellite imagery is not ambiguous on that point, but the word obliterated carries a weight that the full picture does not entirely support. The Isfahan question remains open. The enriched uranium stockpile question remains open. Iran's stated intention to rebuild and expand its nuclear program remains very much alive. And Iran's underground missile network, the hardened tunnel complexes housing its ballistic missile arsenal, was not the target of this operation and remains intact. What Operation Midnight Hammer did prove, and this is the message I think carries furthest beyond the specific conflict, is that the United States now has a demonstrated combat-proven capability to reach and destroy underground facilities that were previously considered invulnerable to conventional attack. That is not a small thing. Every nation that is invested in underground hardening as a strategic deterrent watched June 22nd and updated their calculations. The B-2 is real. The MOP works. And the United States military, when it decides to act, can plan and execute at a level that very few nations on Earth can comprehend, let alone match. What comes next is a political and diplomatic question, but the military answered its question on June 21st. And it answered it definitively. Now I want to hear your take. Do you think Operation Midnight Hammer actually set back Iran's nuclear program long enough to make a strategic difference? Or did we just buy time before they rebuild deeper? Drop your answer in the comments right now. If you want a full breakdown of Iran's underground missile cities and whether those can ever be reached the same way, subscribe and hit the bell. That one is coming next. See you in the next video.